Usually, when we sit down to play a game, whether that's just a casual board game with family on a Friday night or, a competitive sport, there's this foundational expectation of a shared reality.
Right. The rules are the rules.
Exactly. I mean, you buy a property on the board, you hand your colorful paper money to the bank, and you own that square.
Yeah, and if someone lands on it, they pay you rent.
Right. And the rules might be punishing if you get a bad roll of the dice, but they are clearly written down on the inside of the box lid before anyone even picks their game piece.
So you can actually strategize, right? Because you know the parameters of the universe you're operating in.
Yeah, exactly. That predictable framework forms a basic social contract.
Right. The mechanics are basically binary. You take an action, and the corresponding reaction is already predetermined by the rule book.
You can calculate your risk with a high degree of certainty because, well, the boundaries don't shift while the game is actually in motion.
But then, you step away from the game board and into the reality of modern property ownership or middle-class financial planning and municipal governance.
And you realize the rule book has basically been put through a shredder.
It really has. I mean, we are increasingly looking at a financial landscape where the authorities don't just change the rules in the middle of your turn.
No, they actually reach back and penalize you for the moves you made 3 turns ago.
Right, back when those moves were entirely legal and perhaps even openly encouraged by the system itself.
It totally shatters the illusion of control that most of us spend our entire adult lives meticulously trying to build.
Yeah, because when a system can retroactively punish your compliance, the board itself becomes rigged.
Playing by the rules is no longer a defense mechanism.
Not at all.
The Relocate with Revenue podcast with Just and Jan.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in a phenomenon that is likely impacting you, the listener, at this very moment, whether you actively feel the squeeze or not.
We are investigating a concept titled The Real Cost of Freedom Nobody Talks About.
And our guide through this really complex reality is this incredibly detailed presentation by Emro.
Right. She's an entrepreneur, a creator, and the architect behind the platform relocatewithrevenue.com.
She has compiled some incredibly sobering data and real-world case studies that really challenge the conventional wisdom of just, keeping your head down and working harder.
Our objective today is to rigorously unpack the hidden, compounding costs of remaining inside a geographic and financial structure that is fundamentally altering the rules of engagement against you.
Yeah, and we're going to examine the highly specific, deeply ingrained psychological barriers that keep really intelligent, capable people paralyzed in environments that are systematically draining their capital.
And not just capital, but their unrecoverable time.
Right. So, okay, let's unpack this by starting exactly where Emro starts.
Which is not with some dense economic theory.
No, it's with a very visceral, real-world case study involving her own clients.
And this isn't a cautionary tale about reckless investing or like a sudden stock market crash.
Right. It's a story about the devastating impact of a sudden municipal bylaw change, specifically targeting short-term rental operators.
The inciting incident in this case study is really the linchpin of her entire argument, purely because of the sheer aggression of how it was implemented.
Yeah, the municipality in question didn't simply announce a new regulatory framework for short-term rentals to take effect next year.
Right. They bypassed the standard transitional grace periods entirely.
There were no warning letters sent to property owners. Zero.
No compliance notices requesting that operators wind down their listings by a certain date. Nothing like that.
The city simply deployed immediate retroactive fines on properties that had been operating in full legal compliance for months prior to the sudden shift.
And the mechanics of the punishment are just staggering.
They really are, because the fines weren't levied per property or per listing.
No, they were issued per name on the title of the real estate.
Yes. So picture a standard scenario, right? 2 partners co-own a property.
That means a 1,000 Canadian dollar fine was assigned to person A.
And another $1,000 fine to person B.
$2,000 just evaporates.
And it didn't stop there. 8 days later, before anyone could even process the legal ramifications or delist their properties, the exact same fine was levied a second time.
Wow.
Yeah. In the span of just over a week, a single household accumulated $10,000 in municipal fines.
I mean, contextualizing that on a macro level really reveals the underlying motivation of the municipality here.
Right, because reports indicated that the city extracted over 480,000 Canadian dollars in fines from local homeowners during this incredibly brief sweep.
A bureaucratic policy update was essentially weaponized into a massive, highly efficient revenue generation mechanism.
Punishing the very citizens who had invested capital into the local economy in the first place.
To put that in perspective, imagine driving down the highway at the posted speed limit.
Okay.
And then a week later, the city decides the speed limit should have been lower, so they mail you a ticket for the driving you did last Tuesday.
That is insane.
And to make it worse, they send a ticket to you for driving the car, and they send an identical ticket to your spouse who wasn't even in the vehicle.
Just because your spouse's name is on the car's registration.
Exactly. It exposes a system that has abandoned logic in favor of inescapable extraction.
You are being financially penalized purely for your proximity to an asset.
What's fascinating here is the psychological fallout of that retroactive enforcement.
Right. Because the financial damage of a $10,000 fine is painful, obviously.
But the psychological damage is permanent. Retroactive penalties destroy the foundational trust required for a functioning market.
When an owner realizes that past compliance does not protect them from future punishment, everything shifts.
They transition from being a stakeholder in a stable community to basically being a captive in a hostile environment.
It forces the realization that the rules are merely suggestions, malleable at the whim of whoever holds administrative power today.
The system that enticed them to invest, that collected taxes on their purchases and their income, turned around and began charging them exorbitant fees.
Just for the sheer privilege of being trapped inside its borders.
Right. And the immediate reaction for anyone hearing this might be, well, just sell the property.
Yeah, cut your losses, list the house, and walk away.
But M. Rowe illustrates that receiving that $10,000 bill is only the opening act of the nightmare.
Yeah, it initiates a grueling phase she defines as the wait-in.
The wait-in exposes the highly illiquid nature of real estate when systemic changes occur.
Because a municipal hammer drop of that magnitude affects the entire local ecosystem simultaneously.
Exactly. The moment those fines hit, the local real estate market is artificially flooded.
Every short-term rental operator in the jurisdiction is subjected to the same aggressive math.
And they all sprint for the exit concurrently. Supply skyrockets overnight.
And the buyers in that market, well, they have access to all the same news.
They see dozens of identical, fully furnished properties hit the MLS in the exact same week.
They know the sellers are panicked. They know the sellers are bleeding cash every single day they hold on to the asset.
So the power dynamic completely inverts.
Buyers submit these predatory lowball offers and drag out negotiations endlessly.
Because they're secure in the knowledge that the seller has absolutely no leverage and a ticking clock hanging over their head.
This introduces a really critical concept, which is consumed equity.
It's a concept traditional financial models often just gloss over.
Right. While these clients are trapped in the wait-in, agonizing over insultingly low offers, their baseline carrying costs do not pause.
They are legally obligated to service the mortgage.
They have to pay the property taxes, maintain the insurance, keep the utilities running,
and manage the physical upkeep of the structure.
They are essentially forced to fund the life support system of an asset that has been legally lobotomized.
It can no longer generate the revenue it was explicitly purchased to generate.
Yet it demands the exact same level of capital input just to exist.
The crucial realization here is that their wealth didn't just vanish in a momentary market correction.
Right. Their equity was being actively, systematically consumed month over month.
The trap is not the moment the fine is issued.
No. The true trap is the agonizing, prolonged duration required to pry the jaws open and actually escape.
Every 30 days that a property sits unsold, thousands of dollars of previously accumulated wealth are sacrificed.
Merely to sustain a structure that the local government has rendered financially toxic.
It's a sobering scenario because it completely invalidates the traditional roadmap.
It really does. You could do the meticulous research, run the conservative financial projections, secure the funding,
operate perfectly within the legal boundaries provided,
and still have your net worth consumed by an arbitrary administrative pen stroke.
Which leads us to a really profound psychological question that M. Rowe poses.
Yeah, one that challenges you, the listener, to really look inward.
If the environment is becoming this openly hostile, why didn't these individuals, or anyone in a similar situation, recognize the tightening grip and exit sooner?
Because the warning signs of a shifting regulatory landscape are rarely invisible. Right?
Exactly. Why do intelligent people remain inside a structure that is actively dismantling their prosperity?
Rowe approaches this not as an economic failure, but as a psychological paralysis.
She introduces a framework involving 3 distinct psychological barriers.
She refers to them as the 3 disguised siblings.
And the nomenclature there is intentional.
Yeah, siblings share DNA, they interact fluidly, and they reinforce one another.
Most importantly, these specific siblings operate wearing incredibly convincing disguises,
masking the severe financial danger they represent under the guise of rationality.
So let's strip the disguises off these siblings, because understanding them is the only way to break the paralysis.
Absolutely. Sibling number 1 is complacency.
And the disguise complacency wears is the incredibly common phrase, well, everything is fine.
Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's fine. Yeah.
The word fine is arguably the most destructive term in personal finance and lifestyle design.
Complacency relies on our human tendency to normalize slow degradation.
It's the belief that the portfolio will eventually rebound simply because it historically has.
It's the comfort of looking at a property appraisal and noting it is still technically worth slightly more than the initial purchase price.
And then using that marginal gain to justify ignoring a completely hostile regulatory environment.
It's the whole why fix what isn't completely broken mentality.
But Emro argues that fine is an illusion.
It's highly effective camouflage for a system that is experiencing incremental structural failure.
It completely obfuscates the daily hidden costs that fine is extracting from your life energy and your future security.
But wait, I have to pause and challenge this premise a little bit.
Okay, sure.
Because traditional financial wisdom contradicts this entirely.
How so?
Well, if you consult almost any wealth manager, the golden rule during market turbulence is to avoid panic selling.
Right. Time in the market beats timing the market.
Exactly. You are told to weather the storm, to hold the asset, to stay the course. So how are you supposed to differentiate between a standard cyclical dip and a healthy market and the fundamental breakdown of the system itself?
That is the exact tension complacency exploits.
Okay.
See, a cyclical market dip occurs within a stable framework.
Right.
The underlying rules of capitalism and asset valuation remain intact, but external economic variables temporarily depress prices.
So you stay the course because the structural integrity of the market is sound.
Exactly. Emro, however, is highlighting a structural break.
A structural break.
Yes. When a municipality enacts retroactive fines and alters property rights overnight, the foundational math is permanently corrupted.
Wow, okay.
The rules of engagement have been rewritten without your participation.
So complacency basically blinds you to the distinction between a temporary reduction in value and a permanent structural disadvantage.
Perfectly said. It convinces you to apply the logic of weathering the storm to a scenario where the ship's captain is actively dismantling the hull for firewood.
That is a terrifying analogy, but it makes so much sense. That distinction is vital.
It's the difference between waiting out a bad winter and failing to realize you've drifted into an entirely different climate zone.
Right. Let's look at sibling number 2, which often works hand in hand with complacency.
That is familiarity.
And its disguise is the comforting thought, I know how this works.
Familiarity is an incredibly powerful psychological anchor.
It leverages our innate desire to minimize cognitive friction, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Familiarity is knowing the exact route to the grocery store.
It is understanding the nuances of a flawed, perhaps deeply frustrating healthcare system.
Because despite its flaws, you know which forms to fill out and which phone numbers to call.
It's the begrudging acceptance of a punitive tax code, simply because the pain of compliance is a known, predictable quantity.
The devil you know versus the devil you don't.
Familiarity whispers in your ear that the alternative, starting over in a new jurisdiction, is just an impossibly heavy lift.
It magnifies the required expenditure of money, time, and emotional energy.
It paints a picture of having to relearn the basic mechanics of existing.
Right, like how do I register a vehicle? How do I find a reliable contractor?
What are the unspoken cultural rules of doing business in a new place?
The cognitive load of geographic and financial relocation is objectively high.
It is. However, Emro provides a critical counterargument here.
She states that the aggregate cost of staying the daily compounded financial and emotional drain of existing in an extractive structure exponentially outweighs the temporary finite cost of adapting to a new environment.
Familiarity is deceptive through omission.
Exactly. It loudly broadcasts the acute pain of the transition, but it remains completely silent about the chronic terminal cost of the status quo while you hesitate.
Which flows seamlessly into the domain of sibling number 3.
Sibling number 3 is uncertainty.
And this sibling is particularly insidious because its disguise is, well, I just don't know enough yet.
It masquerades as prudence and due diligence.
Right. Uncertainty weaponizes your intelligence and analytical skills against you.
It generates a cascading series of entirely logical questions.
Like, what if the culture shock is too severe?
Or, what if the tax implications of relocating my business are unfavorable?
What if my primary income streams are incompatible with this new geography?
And the result of all these questions is just analysis paralysis.
You sit at your kitchen table, accumulating more tabs on your browser,
Reading another expat blog, watching another cost of living breakdown.
telling yourself you are just being responsible.
But Emro introduces a profound reframing of this fear.
She argues that uncertainty is not a one-way street.
No, the uncertainty of remaining in a system capable of levying $10,000 retroactive fines is objectively just as high, if not higher, than the uncertainty of establishing a new life elsewhere.
I mean, if we examine the psychology of risk assessment, we find that human beings are evolutionarily wired to miscalculate threats in a modern, complex economy.
We exhibit a massive bias toward the familiar danger over the unknown opportunity,
We categorize the status quo as safe strictly because we survived it yesterday.
deliberately ignoring the statistical reality that it is slowly eroding our resources.
Conversely, we categorize the unknown as dangerous simply because it lacks a detailed map.
Rowe dismantles this cognitive bias by introducing the concept of time as an unrecoverable currency.
Yes, waiting for absolute 100% certainty before making a move costs you the most valuable asset you possess.
You can regenerate capital,
But you cannot regenerate the years spent deliberating inside a hostile system.
which brings us to the beating heart of Emro's thesis.
If complacency, familiarity, and uncertainty are the psychological chains keeping you bound to the chair,
Then this next concept is the mechanism actively picking your pockets while you are immobilized.
she labels it the erosion cost.
The erosion cost is arguably the most significant financial line item in the life of the average middle-class professional.
Yet it possesses a dangerous quality complete invisibility.
You will never see the erosion cost itemized on a monthly bank statement.
It doesn't appear in the prospectus of your mutual funds.
And your accountants certainly cannot deduct it on your annual tax return.
Because it's invisible, traditional financial advisors rarely, if ever, factor it into their standard retirement models.
So how do we actually define it?
Emro defines the erosion cost as the compounded aggregate toll of remaining inside a structure that actively works against your prosperity for one additional month, one additional quarter, or one additional year.
It is not characterized by a catastrophic overnight loss.
No, it's the insidious daily friction of an economic and regulatory environment, algorithmically designed to extract a fractionally larger percentage of your wealth than it allows you to retain or grow.
It is the slow bleed.
And Emro provides incredibly relatable metrics for identifying this invisible cost.
Because if you can't see it on a spreadsheet, you have to feel it in your daily life.
You feel the erosion cost when you reach the end of the month and realize you are inexplicably short.
Despite receiving a standard cost of living raise.
You see it when a dual-income household with two professionals working full-time still finds themselves subtly relying on familial wealth.
Borrowing from parents or sharing expenses with siblings just to bridge the gap of a sudden, moderate emergency.
But the most glaring, mathematically undeniable manifestation of the erosion cost is found in what she terms the freedom number gap.
This really exposes the tragic mathematical reality of middle-class financial planning.
Consider the standard trajectory. A professional sits down with a wealth manager half a decade ago
They run the complex algorithms, factor in standard inflation,
and arrive at a freedom number, the specific portfolio valuation required to transition out of mandatory labor and live comfortably on the generated yield.
let's assume, for the sake of the example, that number was firmly established at $1.5 million.
You leave that office with a clear objective. The number is 1.5 million.
You adjust your budget, you maximize your tax-advantaged accounts.
You track your compound interest, and you spend 5 years actively sprinting toward that specific finish line.
However, when you return to that same advisor today to recalculate your trajectory,
The foundation of the math has fundamentally degraded.
due to aggressive systemic inflation vastly outpacing standard projections,
Severe erosion of the dollar's purchasing power.
and the implementation of new burdensome local bylaws or tax structures that shift more of the societal cost onto your shoulders.
The target has moved.
That freedom number is no longer $1.5 million.
The sheer cost of existing has driven that requirement up to $2.5 million.
Think about the psychological devastation of that reality.
It's crushing. You spent 5 of your prime earning years running at maximum capacity toward a defined finish line.
You sacrificed vacations, you delayed purchases, you endured the stress.
And when you finally look up to check your proximity to the goal, the finish line hasn't just drifted a few feet.
It is as if you are running a marathon where the finish line is bolted to the bumper of a heavy-duty truck.
And that truck is accelerating down the highway away from you.
You didn't fail to run fast enough.
No, the objective itself is mathematically designed to outpace your labor.
That exact dynamic forms the core of Emero's argument.
The concept of the hamster wheel is completely stripped of its status as a mere metaphor.
She insists we view it as a strict mechanical reality.
She dissects the physics of this financial apparatus into 3 distinct concurrent vectors of failure.
First, as we just discussed, the track is continuously moving away from you. Your freedom number is artificially inflating.
Second, the track itself is accelerating the velocity of everyday living costs, and inflation is increasing faster than wage growth.
And third, simultaneously, the track is narrowing beneath your feet.
The regulatory environment is constricting, bylaws are changing, and the margin for error is systematically reduced to 0.
It is a profoundly suffocating visualization.
And when you overlay the 3 disguised siblings onto that mechanical wheel, the synergy is terrifying.
Complacency sits on your shoulder and whispers that the wheel is operating normally, so keep running.
Familiarity convinces you that attempting to build a different wheel in an unknown location would be an insurmountable physical and mental task.
And uncertainty insists you cannot step off the wheel until you have a perfect, high-definition map of the ground you are jumping onto.
While those 3 voices keep you locked in motion, the erosion cost is quietly confiscating the surplus value of your labor every single rotation.
If we synthesize the mechanics of the wheel with the psychology of the siblings, we expose the fatal flaw in standard financial advice.
Right, because the mantra of work harder, hustle more, negotiate a small raise, and cut back on your daily expenditures is mathematically insufficient to counter the erosion costs.
You cannot out-earn a macroeconomic structure whose fundamental architecture is engineered to devalue your currency.
And confiscate your equity through fluid regulatory frameworks.
She states it explicitly, which is a really powerful moment of clarity. I did not stop the erosion by earning more.
You cannot hustle your way across a widening chasm.
So what is the viable mechanism for stopping it?
This transition brings us directly to the data-backed reality of the exodus.
Having thoroughly established the unbearable, compounding mathematical cost of remaining on the wheel, Emero pivots from diagnosing the disease to presenting the cure.
She details the surging trend of individuals who are actively breaking the paralysis.
And she outlines the specific strategy they're utilizing to execute their escape.
It is critical to note that she approaches this transition with analytical objectivity.
Right. She does not deal in hyperbole.
No. She clearly states that the Western world is not a universally broken dystopia for every single resident.
However, for a specific, rapidly expanding demographic, particularly the middle-class professional attempting to build and protect wealth,
it is simply no longer the optimal answer to a very precise foundational question.
That question is the pivot point for everything that follows.
I want to repeat it verbatim because it demands reflection.
Okay.
Is there a system where what I have built is worth more and where the rules are not designed to move the ground beneath me?
When an individual permits themselves to ask that question sincerely, temporarily silencing the noise of familiarity and uncertainty, it is a bell that cannot be unrung.
And the macro-level demographic data strongly indicates that millions of people are asking that question.
Calculating the math, answering with a resounding yes, and initiating the logistics of departure.
We are not discussing anecdotal rumblings here.
Yeah.
We are analyzing a measurable, accelerating demographic shift.
The numbers are staggering and they cross international borders.
According to Pew Research, 2.2 million individuals exited the United States in the year 2025 alone.
Across the Atlantic, surveys indicate that 1 in 3 British adults has actively considered the prospect of permanent emigration.
And in Canada, nearly 40% of the millennial and Gen X cohorts are currently contemplating a departure from the country.
Rowe places a significant emphasis on the demographic profile of this exodus.
These are not political radicals seeking an ideological utopia.
They are not eccentric dreamers chasing a fantasy.
They are pragmatic, highly educated, middle-class professionals.
They are individuals who simply sat at their kitchen tables, opened their spreadsheets, and ran the objective numbers.
They quantified their personal erosion cost, realized the math of staying was terminal to their goals, and made a rational, calculated decision to halt the bleeding.
Here is where the abstract macroeconomic data crystallizes into reality, the individual case studies.
Because hearing that millions are leaving is interesting, but understanding the granular mechanics of how a single person executes this shift changes your entire perspective.
Let's examine Emro's personal trajectory first.
She was a licensed practicing realtor in Toronto, Canada.
She had built her own business over years.
By all standard societal metrics, she was a success story.
Yet, her absolute bare-bones, foundational monthly survival cost just to exist in the Toronto market was hovering around $3,800.
Recognizing the impossibility of overcoming the erosion cost in that environment, she executed a strategic relocation to Nairobi, Kenya.
By moving her physical base of operations, her new baseline monthly cost of living plummeted to $1,300.
The mathematical delta, the hard difference between her previous existence and her current one, is $2,500 per month.
That equates to an additional $30,000 of retained uneroded capital every single year.
$30,000 a year.
And the critical insight here is that she didn't manifest that $30,000 by suddenly working 80-hour weeks.
Or attempting to double her sales volume in a fiercely competitive, heavily regulated Toronto real estate market.
She completely circumvented the need for more labor.
She stopped the erosion strictly by altering her geography.
This is the absolute textbook definition of geo-arbitrage.
The concept of geo-arbitrage is the engine driving this entire movement.
At its core, geo-arbitrage is the strategic practice of exploiting the vast discrepancies in cost, currency valuation, and regulatory burden between different geographic markets.
In practical terms, it involves architecting a life where you generate your income in a strong currency or a high-yield economic zone.
But you physically reside and deploy that capital in a jurisdiction where the baseline cost of living is substantially lower.
Crucially, it also means choosing a location where the regulatory environment actively respects and protects your capital,
rather than viewing it as a municipal slush fund.
We see the psychological impact of this strategy perfectly illustrated in the second case study.
Consider Deborah.
She is 52 years old, a former human resources professional, also originating from Toronto.
14 months ago, she finalized her relocation to Medellín, Colombia.
Her baseline monthly cost of living is now a highly manageable $1,600.
CNBC documented her transition, and she provided a quote that fundamentally redefines the purpose of wealth.
The quote is a testament to the lifting of the cognitive burden we discussed earlier.
Deborah stated, "I used to wake up and calculate how far away retirement felt. Now I wake up and calculate, what do I do with my day?"
Wow. That is the sound of the psychological chains breaking.
She transitioned from a life of constant anxious measurement, watching the track accelerate, watching the freedom number recede into the distance,
to a life characterized by immediate autonomy over her own time.
The relief of stepping off the wheel and halting the erosion cost must feel like finally setting down a heavy backpack you forgot you were wearing.
But, let's address the immediate pragmatic skepticism that you, the listener, are likely feeling right now.
Sure, because it sounds idyllic, but can the average person realistically pack up their life and execute this?
How do you resolve the income side of the equation?
You cannot sustain a $1,600 lifestyle in Medellín if your HR salary is entirely dependent on your physical presence in an office tower in downtown Toronto.
That skepticism is totally valid and necessary.
And it bridges perfectly into the operational philosophy Emro advocates,
which she calls the revenue first or income first framework.
The modern application of geo-arbitrage is fundamentally different from the outdated concept of retiring early to a beach on a shoestring budget and hoping inflation doesn't catch you.
It requires a deliberate, structural decoupling of where you earn your capital from where you consume your capital.
To successfully navigate this transition without inviting massive risk, you must first re-architect your income generation into a geographically independent format.
Whether that involves securing remote employment, launching a digital enterprise, transitioning to a consulting model, or structuring reliable passive yield.
The architecture of your revenue must be robust and portable before you physically alter your coordinates.
If you solve the income equation first, the geographic transition transforms from a desperate leap of faith into a massive calculated wealth multiplier.
The viability of that revenue-first framework is reinforced by the third case study.
Michael is 56 years old, a veteran finance professional originally based in London.
20 months ago, he executed his relocation to Chiang Mai, Thailand.
His monthly carrying costs dropped dramatically to $1,100.
It's worth noting that Thailand secured the 4th position globally in the 2025 Internations Expat Survey, highlighting the systemic support for this lifestyle.
So we have analyzed 3 distinct individuals originating from major Western economic hubs, Toronto and London.
Relocating to 3 entirely different continents, Africa, South America, and Asia.
Yet the underlying architecture of their decisions is identical.
They individually quantified the invisible erosion cost.
Realized that remaining compliant on the hamster wheel was mathematically guaranteed to be the most expensive financial decision of their lifetimes.
And engineered an exit.
Reaching that moment of absolute clarity is the critical inflection point.
However, acknowledging the mathematical reality requires successfully neutralizing the internal resistance of complacency, familiarity, and uncertainty simultaneously.
Which brings us to the operational phase of Erosion's methodology.
Because analyzing the trap is merely an intellectual exercise if you lack the specific tools to dismantle it.
Erosion recognizes that motivation without a structured execution plan inevitably devolves back into paralysis.
Moving from the theoretical to the intensely practical, Erosion challenges anyone listening to this to take one highly specific, immediate first step.
It is a private exercise, the mandatory one.
She asks you to mentally line up those 3 disguised siblings: complacency, familiarity, and uncertainty.
And physically write down which one holds the dominant power over your decision-making.
She cautions against answering intellectually.
Don't write down the one that makes you sound the most analytical.
You have to identify the one that causes a physical tightness in your chest when you vividly imagine dismantling your current life and relocating across the globe.
It is a deeply uncomfortable but entirely necessary psychological audit.
The premise is simple. You cannot dismantle a barrier that you refuse to acknowledge.
By forcing yourself to write it down, you externalize the psychological block.
You transition it from a nebulous, ambient anxiety floating in your subconscious into a defined, tangible obstacle written on a page.
Which can then be systematically analyzed and mitigated.
Once that internal barrier is identified and named, she provides the concrete scaffolding to start building the bridge out.
Primarily housed at relocatewithrevenue.com.
She divides the tools based on where you are in the psychological journey.
The first resource is the Relocation Toolkit.
This is specifically engineered for the individual who is still wrestling with the foundational question.
The person asking, should I even be looking at other jurisdictions?
Is the math actually broken for me, or am I just having a bad month?
The cornerstone of this particular toolkit is the Readiness Mirror AI tool.
The fundamental utility of this tool is absolute, unvarnished objectivity.
Its sole purpose is to evaluate your current logistical, financial, and psychological position.
Systematically stripping away the layers of self-deception that human beings naturally employ to protect their comfort zones.
The concept of Readiness Mirror is brilliant.
Think about stepping onto a scale in a stark, brightly lit doctor's office.
You might deeply resent the numbers staring back at you.
You may have spent the last year convincing yourself your health was basically fine, utilizing sibling number 1, complacency.
But the objective reality is that you cannot begin to formulate a protocol to fix a health deficit, or in this case, a severe financial deficit, until you bravely confront the exact, unmanipulated baseline of your current situation.
The AI functions as a dispassionate auditor, removing the emotional padding from the evaluation.
We are evolutionary masters of rationalization.
We continuously placate our anxieties by mislabeling our inaction.
We convince ourselves we are in the planning phase when, in reality, we are trapped in a cycle of worrying.
We stockpile bookmarks and articles, labeling it research when it is functionally just procrastination.
By integrating an AI tool into the initial audit, Erosion is providing a direct countermeasure to Sibling 3, uncertainty, and Sibling 1, complacency.
The algorithm does not possess empathy for your hesitation.
It forces you to answer binary, structural questions that immediately highlight the literal compounding cost of your delayed decision-making.
For the individual who has already stepped on that scale, looked in the mirror, and concluded, yes, the math here is terminal, the inquiry phase is over, I must transition.
She provides the operational roadmap.
This is the digital relocation blueprint.
It shifts entirely from the why and if to the granular how.
It is a comprehensive 82-page 5-module framework built meticulously around the revenue-first philosophy we discussed.
It is not a glossy travel brochure highlighting beaches.
It is a rigorous manual for corporate and personal financial restructuring.
To ensure execution, this blueprint incorporates a secondary AI companion, specifically the Blueprint Mirror AI tool.
The strategic value here is immediate implementation.
Both AI tools are designed for instant download, integrating directly into whichever AI ecosystem you currently utilize.
They function as a continuous background operating system, managing the logistical timeline and providing a structured framework to maintain momentum against the inevitable friction of the transition.
It provides the equivalent of an objective, relentless project manager, dedicated entirely to your personal escape velocity.
But MRO issues a very stark final caveat regarding these tools.
She emphasizes that you are under no obligation to utilize the toolkit or the blueprint today.
However, you must accept the mathematical reality that every subsequent month you choose to remain inside an extractive structure, simply waiting until you feel completely ready to move, is another month where the invisible erosion cost quietly confiscates a percentage of your life's work.
The desire to wait until you feel ready is the ultimate manifestation of familiarity.
It is a logical fallacy.
You will never achieve a state of complete emotional readiness to dismantle the infrastructure of your known existence.
The objective of this process is not the total eradication of fear.
The objective is achieving the analytical clarity to recognize that the compounding terminal math of staying is infinitely more dangerous than the temporary logistical friction of leaving.
Which brings us full circle to the conclusion of our deep dive today.
We have traversed a significant amount of complex terrain.
We began by examining the brutal mechanics of the trap itself, the reality of a municipality levying $10,000 retroactive fines, instantaneously vaporizing accumulated equity and exposing the fragility of the social contract.
We dissected the internal psychology of paralysis, identifying how complacency, familiarity, and uncertainty collude to keep intelligent people bound to a sinking ship.
We defined and quantified the silent killer of middle-class prosperity, the erosion cost.
And we mapped the indisputable mechanical physics of the financial hamster wheel, a track that is simultaneously accelerating, moving out of reach, and narrowing beneath your feet.
Most crucially, we analyzed the pragmatic, data-driven exodus of millions of individuals leveraging geo-arbitrage and the revenue-first architecture to permanently halt their wealth erosion.
As practically demonstrated by the successful transitions of Emro, Deborah, and Michael.
And every single data point, every psychological hurdle, and every case study ultimately funnels back to that one haunting diagnostic question posed by Emro.
It is the filter through which every financial decision should now be passed.
Is there a system where what I have built is worth more and where the rules are not designed to move the ground beneath me?
In the current macroeconomic climate, that is the defining inquiry for anyone seeking to preserve their autonomy and their assets.
You must rigorously evaluate your environment and answer that question for yourself.
If you choose to ignore it, you are effectively granting the system permission to answer it for you. And it will do so by continuing to exact its compounding toll on your labor.
We have spent this entire hour forensically examining the personal, financial, and psychological ramifications of remaining in a hostile environment.
We've analyzed the consumption of your equity, the draining of your time, and the heavy cognitive burden of existing in a state of constant financial friction.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
A perspective that expands the blast radius of Emro's thesis beyond just your personal portfolio.
Consider the generational implications of the erosion cost.
If you fully recognize that you are running on a hamster wheel, and you acknowledge that the mechanics of this wheel guarantee it will be faster, steeper, and narrower 5 years from now than it is today, what exactly are you handing down to your children?
If the rules of the board game are already fundamentally rigged to extract the maximum amount of wealth from you right now, what mathematical chance does the next generation have when they are eventually forced to pick up the dice and play on that exact same board?
Perhaps the real ultimate cost of freedom isn't merely about protecting your personal bank account or securing a lower cost of living for your own retirement today.
Perhaps the true cost of freedom is the courage required to look at a fundamentally broken, openly extractive system and flat out refuse to normalize it for the people coming after you.
That shifts the paradigm entirely.
Relocating ceases to be merely a defensive financial tactic or a personal escape route. It becomes a profound act of generational preservation.
It is the refusal to bequeath a rigged game.
When the bank demonstrates it has the power to retroactively alter the rules and confiscate your property without warning, the most logical, responsible strategy is not to simply grit your teeth and try to roll the dice harder.
The most responsible move is to calmly gather your pieces, fold up the board, and find a jurisdiction that actually respects the game.
Thank you for spending your time with us on this deep dive.
Take these concepts, run your own numbers, question your environment, and we will see you on the next one.